Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute's virtual event series. To fulfill President Reagan's mission of making the Reagan Library a dynamic intellectual forum, our Center for Public Affairs Programming offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day. Each year, we bring you 20 to 30 events from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. Since the March 2020 closure of many businesses across our great country, the Reagan Foundation is now bringing its events online to ensure that we are still delivering world-class content, even if you can't get to our hilltop to watch it in person. In this week's Center for Public Affairs virtual event, we bring you Ben Shapiro, host of The Ben Shapiro Show, the #1 conservative podcast in the nation, and winner of the Best News Podcast from the 2019 iHeartRadio Podcast Awards. Ben's career path began at an early age. He was hired by Creator Syndicate at age 17, becoming the youngest nationally syndicated columnist in the United States. His columns are still printed in major newspapers and websites every week. He is also the author of several national bestsellers and a contributor to hundreds of radio and television shows around the nation. He has actually spoken at the Reagan Library 3 times in the past, 2 from when he worked at AM 870's The Answer, and then just a year ago when he came to the Reagan Library to launch his last book, The Right Side of History: How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. He's here with us today to have a virtual discussion of his brand new book, How to Destroy America in 3 Easy Steps, which shows that to be a cohesive nation, we have to uphold foundational truths about ourselves, our history, and reality itself, to be unionists instead of disintegrationists. We now invite you to enjoy our virtual program, coming to you from our Air Force One Pavilion Leadership Academy Oval Office, with Ben Shapiro and Reagan Foundation and Institute Executive Director John Heybusch.
Ben Shapiro, just fantastic to have you, especially right on the heels of publishing yet another terrific book. So thanks for joining us at the Reagan Library today, Ben. We really appreciate it. Before I get into the book, Ben, I wanted to ask, what was it about your upbringing that made a Harvard lawyer type, Harvard Law School grad, Californian, become a conservative? Because you'd think it might not really normally turn out that way. What was it?
I mean, all blame on my parents, I think. So I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish household. Orthodox Jews tend to vote very heavily conservative and have for at least several decades. And so because I was growing up in an Orthodox household, even though both my parents worked in Hollywood, we were raised with very traditional social values, very traditional sort of hawkish values on foreign policy, very pro-Israel values, obviously. And so when I went to college and I experienced the wild leftism at UCLA, that also sort of illuminated to me that these were not default positions, things that I considered sort of normal and rational, and they made sense to me, that these were considered wild outlier positions, that this was actually a counterculture now. And so I was sort of activated to become overtly political when I was on college campuses. Now, I was always interested in history. I was always interested in politics, but I thought when I went to college that I was going to major in genetic science and music, because I was a world-class violinist at the time. And as soon as I walked on campus, I saw the UCLA Daily Bruin, which is the student newspaper very much to the left. And there's an editorial in there comparing then the Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, to Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi. And so I immediately walked into the Daily Bruin op-ed page editor and asked if I could write a counter. And that eventually turned into sort of a point-counterpoint column I did, and then a regular column that I did, the sort of provocateur conservative stuff on college campus. And that developed into, actually a syndicated column and then a career path. So it was certainly not something that I thought was going to happen when I was 16 years old and I started UCLA, but that's the way that it went.
Yeah, well, that's neat because you're actually able to identify a spark or a moment in time that kind of kicked it all off for you. That's not usually the case.
Yeah, I mean, it was more sort of the realization that very outlandish and morally absurd positions had become commonplace on one side of the political aisle. And it was like, okay, well, you can either engage or you can disengage. I chose to engage. And once you're in the battle, it's very difficult to withdraw from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Give me the elevator speech on this book, Ben.
So the basic idea of the book is that there are two possible paths for the country. One is a path where we stay together as a country, and the other is a path where we split apart as a country. And the path where we stick together is a path where we return to thinking about the things that brought us together in the first place, the roots of the founding philosophy, the common history that we share as a country. It has dark points and terrible stories, but is overall a story of triumph and of triumphing over the sinfulness of human nature via increased civilization and foundational values. That we share a culture of entrepreneurialism, a culture of adventure, a culture that values virtue in social institutions, family, churches. These are all the things we share. And then there's a second view of the future of the United States, and that's a view of the United States where we're essentially a bunch of competing interest groups clubbing each other over the head to grab the government gun and use it against one another. And the country is going to fall apart if it goes that way, but there are some deep philosophical roots to that particular point of view. In the book, I articulate these two views as unionist, meaning we can come together around some foundational values, versus disintegrationist, meaning people who actively root for the disintegration of the United States. Now, if you actively root for the disintegration of the United States, it doesn't mean that you want California to secede from the Union or Texas to secede from the Union. What it means is that you don't really care about your fellow Americans being treated as fellow citizens with inalienable rights. You really just see people as either tools of your agenda or obstacles to your agenda. And the only thing that matters is whether you can promulgate your agenda from the top down using whatever institutions are at your disposal. And we've seen that happening in real time today. We've seen this vast gap emerge between people who have a traditional view of American history and people who have a revisionist view of American history. We've seen this amazing gap emerge between people who believe in the founding philosophy of the Declaration of Independence and people who oppose that founding philosophy and believe that it's a lie that ought to be overthrown. We see that gap between people who value the culture of virtue and entrepreneurialism and adventure versus the people who believe that there should be a culture of entitlement and expectation from fellow citizens and from the government. And as those gaps emerge and as they widen and as they become politicized, it's important to recognize the roots of them, because I think that we very often in politics fight these battles on the surface, and they usually manifest as election battles. Which politician do you like? Who cares more about people like you? But the reality is that there's some very deep underlying issues at the root of America's, it seems like, constant collapse at this point. That need to be examined if we actually do want to hold this thing together.
You already referenced it once, but I saw it verbatim in the book, Ben. You talk about the fact that the countercultures become the culture. And I couldn't help but, obviously here at the Reagan Library, we see a lot of things through a Reagan lens. And the quotation that came to mind as I read throughout your book was Reagan's warning that freedom is just one generation away from extinction. It's not in the bloodstream. Is that an accurate portrayal of the book?
Absolutely. I mean, it's something that I've been mimicking Reagan about since I found out about that Reagan quote 20 years ago. The fact is that people have a natural tendency to assume that all of the things they experience in their daily lives are natural to humanity. So if you live in the United States and you are born into, by any historical standard, tremendous prosperity, tremendous freedom, tremendous liberty to do what you want, you think that's the natural state of affairs. And therefore you can hammer away at the foundations of the society and everything will continue to stand on air, as it were. The third story of the building will not be affected if you simply explode the foundations of the building. And you're seeing this in real time as people take basic principles like equal rights before the law, and they decide that this is no longer workable. We have to get rid of that. Don't worry, you'll still have all of the same liberties you currently experience, but we'll just, kind of change how we view equal rights under the law, and we'll judge you by the group that you belong to in the name of social justice. We take American prosperity and we say, well, what if we just restrict entrepreneurialism and business in favor of government redistributionism and government control of the distribution of resources in the society? You'll still have the exact same level of prosperity and freedom that you currently experience, because that's natural. The only thing we'll do is we'll just fix the system itself. Meanwhile, you blame the system itself for any sort of disparity that exists. And this is one of the true aspects and one of the true conflicts that we're seeing on an individual level in the United States, is whether people see the system as responsible for their personal issues or whether they largely take blame or credit for their own personal accomplishments. We have an entire political class, and I don't think it's entirely partisan. I think that politicians are largely incentivized to tell you they can solve your problems. That's literally like any other salesperson, like any used car salesman who tells you that you need this car, or like any mechanic who tells you that you need to buy a new transmission when you don't necessarily need a new transmission. The first step of that is to tell you the transmission is broken and they alone can fix. You see this from a lot of our politicians on all sides of the aisle, that whatever problems you have in your life, that's not your fault. That's not decision-making. What that is the system failing you. And so all we have to do is blow up the system, and then it'll fix all of it. Now, there are gradations here. Some people want to tinker with the system here and there. Some people believe that the system is so deeply and inherently flawed that it has to be torn out at the root, right? This is the perspective of Isabel Wilkerson, whose book Caste basically argues that this is, or Caste is basically the argument that the foundational American ideas need to be torn away because the entire house is rotted. But the key principle of Americanism is that you are in charge of your own life, and that comes with tremendous freedom. It also comes with tremendous and terrible responsibility.
I think you make the point early in the book, Ben, about how in these revolutions, in this case, in disintegration, they often have the tendency to eat their young. And it reminded me, as I saw that passage in the book, of our friend Wheeler, Mayor Wheeler of Portland, Oregon. Here is a prima facie case, right, for the revolution eating its young. I wonder if you saw the same parallels.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, whenever there is a revolution, the people who are leaders in the revolution end up being the second to the guillotine, right? Everybody else goes first, and then they go. And we're seeing that right now. I mean, you saw this with the mayor of Minneapolis, who was doing performative wokeness in front of a crowd and being excoriated and shouted down. You saw Mayor Ted Wheeler, who's allowed his city to become basically hostage to Antifa, and he is out there in public being screamed at. You're seeing this with a bevy of Democratic politicians, all of whom feel the necessity to cave to the most radical among them, or find themselves on the guillotine. And most importantly, you do see it with corporate America. So corporate America, which I do talk about at length in the book, has an unfortunate tendency to cave to the loudest, the loudest, the squeakiest wheel. That's the way that they operate. Is they're risk averse. They don't want the bad media coverage. So it is much easier to sort of hire Robin DiAngelo to do a $20,000 diversity session to avoid prospective liability or bad media attention than it is to actually stand up and say, no, this is garbage. We run a business, and we're going to continue to run a business, and we have no real opinion on whether America is a systemically racist country, except to say that we have not engaged in racism in any way that we can identify, which would be the manly way of standing up for your business, frankly. But most businesses don't do that. They're very much afraid of their woke staffers, woke employees, the woke media. And so the incentive structure is right now very much in favor of the people who can scream the loudest about how the system is to blame for all of their problems.
Well, you made a point in the book about how, America's right now, it feels like it's going through a divorce. And, this is not a pretty divorce. It's a very ugly situation. I conjured up the image in my mind, Ben, and I wonder what you'll get your reaction to it, but it's almost like it's a divorce between Siamese twins. I mean, because we are irreparably stuck together, yet going through this divorce. And, what's the outcome of that? Often those surgeries are not real pretty.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's hard to see how this ends particularly well. And one of the points that I make in the book is that the disintegrationist position, which is essentially that all politics is just the politics of power, that there's no commonality of principle doesn't matter. It is just a matter of various interest groups going up against one another. You see this in the 1619 Project that suggests that the Constitution and the Declaration really are just manifestations of white supremacy. You see it in the Bernie Sanders sort of Marxism that says that founding ideology, the founding fathers were really motivated mostly by protection of their own economic interests. Right? The idea that politics is basically just the art of exerting power over somebody else via the mechanisms of government. That basic argument leads to some really ugly results, particularly as you see many members of the Democratic Party seeking to overthrow institutional boundaries. So because the founders believed that rights preexisted government, their idea was we have to structure a government such that it is incapable of invading rights. The progressive wing of the disintegrationist movement basically argues the opposite, that because rights come from government, you need a bigger government in order to effectuate those rights. And therefore, the institutions of government must be reshaped along with the times in order to maximize the power of government. Well, what that means is that in the founding vision, there was a lot more tolerance for diversity of thought, right? You could have local rule, you could have subsidiarity, you could have state and local governments that thought differently and acted differently and legislated differently, and people could leave each other alone on a broader level. What you see from the national level now is that nobody can be left alone. Everyone will be forced to care. And the government, all instruments of the government that somehow militate against concerted action must be done away with. So the United States Senate is no longer representative. We have to discuss getting rid of the United States Senate altogether because Montana has as many senators as California. We need to make sure at the very least that we add a couple of states that are definitely Democratic states, like Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., to the U.S. Senate to add 4 senators for the Democrats. We need to pack the courts. The courts are really bad. Now, as soon as this becomes inconvenient for Democrats, they will immediately reverse themselves on this, right? If the U.S. Senate becomes an instrument of democratic power, then all of a sudden it'll be, we need to maintain all of the institutions that enshrine our power. And when Republicans are in charge, it's all, the filibuster's wonderful. As soon as Republicans are out of charge, it's get rid of the filibuster immediately. Here's the problem with that. Once you start seeing the government gun as merely a tool for cramming down power, you are almost necessitating action by people whose rights are being invaded, because again, there are no protections for them anymore. There is no buffer zone between the majority simply deciding what it wants and your rights. Your rights simply go the way of the dodo bird. And that's what the founders feared. I mean, the founders set up all these institutional checks and balances specifically because they did not like the idea of a pure majoritarian mob running roughshod over the rights of a political minority. But that's very much what some people are advocating for. And that's actually going to exacerbate division. It doesn't make us more unified. A more unified government makes us more disunified, because it means we actually have to care very deeply whether somebody we don't like is elected to the head of the government, because that person is immediately going to turn his guns on all the things that we hold dear.
Yeah. Do you see the 1960s and the whole anti-establishment and the riots and all the rest of that occurred at that time frame? Are we just kind of revisiting that in your mind, albeit with different issues at a different time?
I mean, I think that it's the natural fruition of a lot of the ideologies in the 1960s, the replacement of the constitutional bargain with the idea that the big government centralization of power was going to heal all wounds. The anti-imperialist sentiments of the anti-Vietnam War seem to have taken over a lot of our teaching about what America is. America is inherently bad. An American footprint is inherently bad. We need to minimize America's role in the world. The correct critique of Jim Crow society and racism generally in American society, that critique has now been taken to an extraordinary new and different level. A complete redefinition of the term racism has now taken place. Shelby Steele talks about this. The definition of racism used to be pretty obvious and open. The definition of racism was you believe in the inferiority or superiority of a particular group of people based on race. Right? That is a pure, easy definition of racism. It is easy to apply. It is easy to spot, and it's fact checkable. Right? It's actually falsifiable. The new definition of racism is that any disparity in American society is evidence of discrimination in American society. And that is utterly unfalsifiable. There's no way to falsify it because it's the God of the gaps. You're now saying that anytime there is any disparity whatsoever, any confounding factor either doesn't exist, or you can explain the confounding factor itself by reference to one level deeper racism. So if you're talking about higher crime rates in inner city Black communities, and you say, well, that really doesn't have to do with race or even racism, that has to do with lack of fathers in the home. Then the next move is, yes, but fathers aren't in the home because of the American racist system. And we say, well, hold up a second. In the early 20th century, Black Americans were actually married at a higher rate than white Americans. And as late as 1960, the Black illegitimacy rate was 20%. Now it's in excess of 70%. They say, right, but that's because racism went underground and became all of these social systems that are now being effectuated against Black Americans. The idea being that you can always retreat to an unfalsifiable thesis that doesn't actually solve the problem, it exacerbates the problem. So much of our current discourse has nothing to do with solving the problem. It has to do with continuing to reinforce a narrative that indicts America as inherently evil and inherently wrong and blames the system entirely for problems that are fixable if we are willing to take personal responsibility for them and if we are willing to hold everybody to the same exact moral standard.
Yeah, of course, we've heard for months now this whole, the jargon of systemic racism. Just yesterday, for the first time, now the problem is it's structural racism. The lexicon it just keeps growing and growing, right?
Well, it's the deliberate vagary of the terms is designed to create confusion. That's what it is for. Right? This is a point that Thomas Chatterton Williams has made. He says, like, you're using terminology specifically in vague ways so that there's no way to debunk it. So if somebody says to you structural racism, you say, okay, which structure is racist? And then they'll say, no, you don't understand. It's just out there. Well, okay, well, now we're ghost hunting because I don't have an identifiable problem that I can solve. If you say to me that there's a policy that is specifically discriminating against one group of people in favor of another group of people, we can all agree that's racist, unless apparently if it's affirmative action, in which case it is not racist for some odd reason. But when it comes to structural racism, the argument is sort of tripartite. One is that history has consequences, which of course is true, that past discrimination has current effects. That of course is true, but it doesn't solve the problem in any way right now. And then there's the argument that all disparities now in action matter not, like literally don't matter at all because of historic discrimination, which is utterly false. And then there's the argument that put aside historic discrimination, the structures themselves right now are racist, and that's just false on its face as well. So the first argument is true, but doesn't go very far. The second argument is false, and the third argument is extraordinarily false. But by saying structural racism, you force people to embrace a term that can be used in certain true ways, but the implications of which are completely untrue. And so this is what members of the left like to do. They like to use what we call semantic overload in linguistics. They like to take phrases, and then they like to load them with multiple meanings. And then if you deny the phrase, then they pick the most innocuous meaning of the thing and say, well, this is what you're denying. So perfect case in point, Black Lives Matter. It is perfectly inarguable that Black lives matter just as much as white lives. Every single human being in the United States, with very few exceptions, believes this and believes it to their core. But the phrase Black Lives Matter has been semantically overloaded so that it also means that America is systemically racist, or it means the program of the Black Lives Matter organization. So if you say Black Lives Matter, you are assumed to also believe that America is systemically racist, which is false, or that the Black Lives Matter organization is good, which is also false. If you say, I'm not going to say that because it's semantically overloaded, then members of the disintegrationist core will immediately say, well, that's because you don't care about Black people because you won't say the phrase Black Lives Matter. So this is just a semantic game. And when you ask for clarification, the usual response is, well, I don't have to clarify. If you don't understand, you just don't get it, which is the last refuge of both idiocy and dishonesty.
My theory is, as you watch these statues fall, as you watch things being torn down, it seems as though there's a view on their part that we must first destroy the past entirely in order to create this world they're talking about, right? In other words, we can improve the future, but first we have to destroy the past.
Yes, I mean, that's exactly correct. And it's the entire past. Right? You're seeing statues torn down of Frederick Douglass. You're seeing statues being torn down of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, these are people whose historic value to the United States was specifically in alleviating many of the founding era problems with slavery. You've seen it. There's a statue torn down in Wisconsin of an abolitionist soldier who died in the line of duty. I mean, these are not people who should have their statues torn down for any responsible reason. But the idea here is that all of America's past is inherently evil, and so we must wipe that away. As I've said before, we are now. It must be incredible for all of us to live in a time with the only good people who have ever lived. These are the only good people who have ever lived, the people who are tearing down statues. Everybody from the past is evil, but they themselves are incredibly good and incredibly wonderful, and the repositories of all morality. See, this is why the statues have to be torn down, because if you recognize that you stand on the shoulders of other people who are flawed, you may have to recognize that you yourself are flawed, and maybe you should have a little bit of epistemic humility. Maybe you might want to take a look at your own moral system and say, okay, I may be right about things, I may be wrong about things, let's have a discussion about it. But by suggesting that you are the font of all wisdom, and not only that, you are a priori a font of wisdom, that you don't stand on anybody's shoulders, that means that no one can question your bona fides, no one can question your moral system. Robert George, the professor of philosophy at Princeton University, he recently did a Twitter thread about this. He said that he was teaching a philosophy class, and he asked his students, okay, we're going to do a thought experiment. You're all living in 1850s Alabama now. How many of you are abolitionists? And of course, every single hand in the room goes up. And he says, well, I don't believe you because you're abolitionists now because it's 2020. And good for you. I mean, everyone is an abolitionist. But can you name a thing in your life where you would defy your entire family for a position that is not only wildly unpopular, but seen as morally wrong at the time? And would you risk your career? Would you risk your family? Would you risk your life? Would you risk your wealth? Would you risk your livelihood? If you can't name a thing in your life that you're doing that for right now, and not like not a fake thing where you're actually rewarded for the media, but like an actual thing where you're actually taking on a level of risk to do something quote unquote courageous, then why would you think that you would have been doing that sort of thing in 1850 when people thought extraordinarily differently? And when what we now take for moral granted, as we should, and built on the shoulders of those people, not the people of Alabama, but the people who defeated them in the Civil War, that you are better than all of the people who have lived before you. The sort of extraordinary ahistorical arrogance of believing that you hit a triple when you were born on third base has completely taken over the country.
Yeah. You wrote a bestseller not too long ago, and the central premise was we've let universities indoctrinate our youth to a liberal strain of thought for a long time now. And I'm wondering if you feel like, yep, now we're reaping the rewards.
No question. So my first book was about brainwashing on college campuses. It's called Brainwashed. It came out in 2003. So it's now been 17 years since I wrote that book. And I warned about it at the time. It was pretty obvious it was happening. It wasn't to the extent that it has now, where you have full on speech codes and people being banned from campus, and anybody who thinks differently, even if you're a socialist like Brett Weinstein, being thrown off of campus at Evergreen State College for the great sin of teaching because he is a white person. He wasn't supposed to teach that day. It hadn't reached the point where people like Charles Murray were being physically assaulted for speaking on campuses. But I was saying this stuff 20 years ago, and I mean, frankly, William F. Buckley was saying it 70 years ago. The takeover of our colleges and universities has been a disastrous thing. There was a sort of conservative, I would say, sanguinity about all of this, a certain conservative viewpoint that said, okay, well, that crazy stuff is happening on college campuses. That's been happening since the 60s. These kids will grow up. They'll go into the workplace. They'll get a job. They'll realize that real life is hard. They'll have to pay taxes. And eventually, the old Churchill saying apocryphal saying will apply that if you're a liberal, if you're a conservative when you're 20, you have no heart. And if you're a liberal when you're 40, you have no brain. Eventually, they will get to the point where they grow a brain. Well, what if all those people exited college and they just shaped society to meet their view of what society ought to be? And you're seeing that happening right now. I mean, the New York Times newsroom was just taken over essentially by Nicole Hannah-Jones and the 1619 Project crowd. And they ousted the op-ed editor, and they basically constructively fired Barry Weiss for the great sin of having any sort of differing opinion. And Barry Weiss is no social conservative. I mean, Barry Weiss is very, very liberal on social issues. So the takeover of corporate America by these folks, to the point where if you put up a Trump photo on your Facebook page, you may end up, on the firing line for any major company in the United States. The idea that if you say that Black Lives Matter as an organization, not as a slogan, as an organization is bad, or that you're not going to go march in a parade that suggests that America is systemically racist, if you don't post a black square on your Twitter, then you're inherently a bad person. That sort of stuff has completely taken over so many aspects of American life because the university students were coddled. They were told by the administrators that they were going to reshape all of society to meet their whims. And they came out and they restructured society around those whims. We're watching the effects of it today.
When you see Antifa marching through the streets, usually at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and everybody's all dressed in black and they've got weapons and they've got, they're highly organized. Do you get the sense then that most, if not all of this stuff is homegrown, or are we actually experiencing forces either from the outside or foreign forces? It just seems like there's a lot of money and organization behind all this, and I wonder if you think that's the case.
I mean, I think it's probably rather disorganized. I think it's largely homegrown. I don't think it's a matter of some nefarious figure signing a big check. I don't think that bricks and bats are supremely expensive, or that commercial grade fireworks cost a fortune. Largely, these are young performative white wokesters who are getting their kicks by doing this sort of stuff. That's not particularly new. I mean, you go all the way back to the World Trade Organization riots of like 1996, 97, you saw this kind of stuff. But the level of action en masse is really extraordinary. And maybe some of that is the acceleration of technology. People can coordinate via cell phone. They can mob very, very quickly. But a lot of that is just that public officials have refused to do anything about it. And this stuff, Richard Daley in Chicago would not have stood for this, right? And he's a Democrat. Richard Reardon in LA would not have stood for this kind of liberal Republican. Giuliani in New York, Bloomberg wouldn't have stood for this. You have an extraordinary number of public officials who have basically decided that they're just going to allow this sort of chaos to continue so long as they can blame the system. Because again, their pitch, which is the system is flawed and bad, includes the system that they're a part of. This is the inherent flaw in their program, right? Their argument was elect us to the system and we will remake the system such that it benefits you. And then a group of people come along and say, that's not enough. You're still part of the system and the system itself is to blame. They don't have a comeback to that. The liberal left has found itself utterly defenseless in the face of a left that says, well, you say that the system only needed sort of trims around the edges. We're saying that we need to uproot the entire tree. What do you say to that? And liberals have said, well, because now they're being forced to advocate in favor of a system that they themselves think requires fundamental change. If you say that this system requires fundamental change, what you meant by fundamental change is we still kind of like capitalism, we still like law and order, we still like basic protections of private property, but you've never actually advocated for any of those things. You just sort of assumed that they were the common state of mankind. Then when the hard left comes and says, well, we don't like any of those things, law and order is bad, private property is bad, capitalism is bad, you have no defense mechanism to this. And not only that, when the left says you're racist if you oppose us, the left liberals have no defense mechanism because they've been using the term racist to describe every policy they disagree with for decades. Now that that tactic has been turned on them, they really have no comeback, and it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, you mentioned a number of mayors, and I just wonder is it as simple as I want to be reelected, so I'm going to take a step back and just watch this happen, or is it more complicated than that?
I think it's mildly more complicated. I think it goes back to their core ideology is, again, that crime, poverty, bad action are all systemically caused. Right? There's a fundamental religious belief of a lot of people who happen to be on the left is that every individual problem, every bad action can be attributable to discrimination, to the system, to brutal systems of exploitation. Right? This is a fundamental vision that is shared by virtually all of Marxist theorists, whether you're talking critical race theory, which is sort of an outgrowth of that, or whether you're talking about pure Marxism, which is or pure Marxism, which is the basic idea that individual activity is completely shaped by environment, that individuals don't exist absent their environment, right? Which is why if you shift the entire, the real pitch of Marxism is not we're all going to be more prosperous. The real pitch of Marxism is allow us to destroy the entire system and rebuild it ground up, and you will get a new man, right? You'll get the new Soviet man who's better motivated and who's more wonderful to people, and original sin disappears. Human beings under a wonderful communal system are just better than other human beings. And so if you believe that, if you're on the liberal left, you believe people are inherently good, but it's systems that make them bad, then when people act badly, that is actually more evidence that the system needs to be changed. And so you have no ability to stand up to that because now you're a defender of a system, and you can't be a defender of a system because your ideology explicitly forbids you to defend any system that results in people being angry or bad or cruel or criminal.
Did you see I'm sure you must have been, the recent interview of the Black Lives Matter spokeswoman in Chicago? Essentially, she said that all this street level looting, all that's happening, this is just reparations in action.
I mean, that is the natural outgrowth of the sort of 1619 Project attitude. I mean, Nicole Hannah-Jones literally tweeted out that she was happy that they were calling them the 1619 riots. So if the basic idea of the 1619 Project is that every area of American life, every area of American prosperity, every area of American rights and freedoms is generated by bigotry. I mean, that is the explicit mandate of the 1619 Project. They say literally every area of American life is rooted in the importation of black slaves to the United States in 1619. And then a series of essays attributes everything from maternal mortality disparities to traffic patterns to racism in the United States, suggests that modern day capitalism is an outgrowth of slavery, which is completely ahistorical nonsense on every single level. I mean, I discuss it at length in the book, actually. If you believe that, then any attempt to tear down the system is inherently a form of reparation. Any attempt to tear down the system is necessary. This is, I mean, I'm not conjecturing this. This is explicitly said by both Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, is that what anti-racism means is tearing down any system that produces inequality. That's what it means to be an anti-racist. It doesn't mean that you oppose racism. It means you oppose any system that produces any disparity along racial lines at all, which means that the entire system has to be torn down, and anything you do to tear down the system is inherently anti-racist. So if you rob Walmart, right, most of us would say, well, I don't understand what robbing a Walmart has to do with attempting to curb police brutality in Minneapolis. Like, how does breaking into the Foot Locker in downtown LA fix the problem? The answer is you're striking back against the evil capitalist system that has produced the inequality and the racism that lead to incidents like George Floyd. That's the actual chain of logic that's being used by the so-called anti-racist crowd, which actually is extraordinarily pro-racist. They share an enormous amount of language with actual overt white supremacists.
Why is it that we rarely, at least I rarely ever see a mention or a reference to Martin Luther King from the Black Lives Matter movement?
Martin Luther King is part of the bad side in this particular narrative. So what they will attempt to do is they'll try to hijack the legacy of Martin Luther King that we all care about. And they'll try and focus in on some of his more Marxist economic leanings. And they'll point out the fact that he was in favor of certain strikes by sanitation workers in Memphis, for example. They'll focus in on sort of his reparative language with regard to economics. They won't focus in on the central pitch, which is the reason we have Martin Luther King Day and the reason that everybody knows the I Have a Dream speech, which is the basic theme that we should treat each other by individual character as opposed to skin color. This has fallen out of favor. In fact, it is an aspect of racism to believe it. If you're a white person, you say, I don't see color. You're literally taught on college campuses that is a racist statement. If you say I'm colorblind, it's because you're racist, because other people have colors. To say that you're colorblind is to ignore a critical aspect of who they are, and that means that you are ignoring their race, which means counterintuitively that you actually are racist. Martin Luther King has fallen completely out of favor with the Black Lives Matter crowd. If they do try to reclaim Martin Luther King, it's to reclaim the radical tendencies that actually Americans don't typically celebrate. This is one of the things that's so bizarre about how members of the disintegrationist left treat American history, which is when it comes to Martin Luther King, most of us have the things that we think King should be honored for, and we don't pay a lot of attention to the stuff that was sort of ancillary to that mission. And the disintegrationist left will say, no, you have to look at his whole philosophy as a whole, and you have to put him in context. And then if you point to Thomas Jefferson, they'll say context doesn't matter at all. Nothing he says matters. Everything is condemned to hell by this terrible aspect of his life. So it's very interesting when folks tend to use context around historical figures and when they don't.
At the same time, I wonder then to what extent do you think that Trump's approach, his style, has been like gas on the fire? I mean, does he bear some responsibility for this?
I mean, listen, I think these divides obviously pre-existed Trump. There were riots in Ferguson in 2014. There were riots in Baltimore 2015. So you can look at the polls on racial feeling in the United States. The vast majority of Americans were very hopeful in 2008. By 2015, they were really, really not. And that happened over the course of Obama's presidency. I've said before, I think Trump is more the coroner than the murderer of American politics. He came along and he just revealed that the body was dead, right? And I think that that's true. Has he calmed things at all? Of course not. I mean, he has exacerbated things with stupid rhetoric, with idiotic tweets, with going off teleprompter and saying unprompted, very, very foolish and counterproductive things. Right? None of that is particularly helpful. As far as BLM, again, I don't want to say that everybody who's protesting with BLM is ill-motivated or even understands what a lot of the movement is about. I think a lot of people just saw the George Floyd tape and they were upset about it and they went marching. I think that's as deep as a lot of human activity goes. And, I think that there's a case to be made that when it comes to police, the levels of qualified immunity that ought to be held, I think that there's a case to be made that perhaps there should be some curbs to that, minor curbs to that. I would say I think that there's a case to be made that police unions have way too much power. But the overall BLM movement has been, and I mean here, the organization and the sort of non-solutions oriented agenda has been very bad for the country. As far as President Trump's activity, he certainly has not calmed the waters. Now, I don't think the media would allow him to. I think they have a full stake in preventing him from in any way calming the waters, right? They never gave him credit for criminal justice reform, for example. Right? He did criminal justice reform in an explicit attempt to try and rectify certain imbalances. And instead of them saying, okay, he gets credit for that, it was, how's he trying to exploit the black vote this time? Here he is, look at him being subject to the whims of Kanye West and Kim Kardashian, all this kind of sort of stuff. So there are many things can be true at once. One, Trump is gasoline on the flame. Two, Democrats really have an interest in pretending that a stove fire is in fact a raging forest fire. And three, the media are bound and determined to turn any stovetop fire into a massive acreage-eating forest fire.
Yeah, sells papers, draws eyeballs, right, that whole thing. Silent majority. I mean, there's all this energy on the left, and of course, what some of the folks in the Trump campaign, the RNC, and others are, if you're on the other end of the spectrum, you're surely hoping that this silent majority is out there and that it exists. Do you think it does? And does that give Trump some hope of being reelected? So,
I think that whenever you are in a one-on-one race, there's a shot that you win. Right now, I would say that, at current, he probably has about a 45% shot of being reelected, 45% shot of being reelected. That's sort of what the betting markets are suggesting. I think that's probably about right. Are there shy Tories? Absolutely. There are definitely shy Trump voters who are not telling pollsters that they're voting for Trump. It is considered a gauche act to consider voting for Trump. I think there are a lot of people, particularly in swing states, who will vote for Trump and not tell their friends that they're actually voting for Trump. So I think there is some of that. Do I think that it is 5 percentage points? No. Do I think that it is, a percentage point? Maybe. In nationally, and maybe a few tens of thousands of votes in key states, which means something. Would I count on it? I mean, I've never count on data that doesn't exist to promulgate the argument that Trump is an inevitable shoo-in for victory. The biggest problem is that do I think there's a silent majority of Americans who disagree with the radical agenda? absolutely. I think one of the interests the Democrats have is in hiding the radical agenda, which is why they nominated Biden, not Bernie. Right? They nominated Biden specifically in order to not nominate Bernie. That is the only reason that this not very alive human has been nominated by the Democrats. And it's the reason why, by all polling data, he is winning right now, is because he is not Trump and he is not considered radical. Now, the problem is that he absolutely is the Trojan horse for radicalism. Kamala Harris is extraordinarily radical. Bernie Sanders basically wrote the DNC platform. Biden is no bulwark against the radical left. He was a very, very progressive senator. He was a very progressive vice president. And the notion that he's going to provide some sort of bulwark against disintegrationist philosophy, I find utterly unevidenced on any level. This is a person who will go wherever he is pushed, politically speaking. And if the left is pushing, he'll move.
You know, Ben, I listened to you a great deal pre-Trump running for president, and well, actually, when Trump was running for president, and you know, you had all the concerns at the time, which are the same concerns I think you have now. I wonder if you feel like post-Trump, whether that's this November or 4 years from now, are conservatives going to need to kind of recalibrate, take a step back, in order to determine what being a conservative really means? Or do you think because of Trump's involvement in the conservative movement as president in the last few years have set the conservative movement on a trajectory that you might not be so agreeable with?
I mean, I think that there's going to be a really interesting debate to be had, and I think that debate has been ongoing for a long time previous to Trump. I mean, the fact is that George W. Bush was a very, very big government guy. I mean, he raised spending. He called himself a compassionate conservative, which is a modifier I don't think needs to be added to the term conservative in the first place. By compassion, he meant I'm going to spend a lot of money on things like education and Medicare Part D. That debate has existed for a long time in the Republican Party. The last Republican president who really discussed the idea of smaller government and limited government was Reagan. And then he was saddled with a Democratic Congress for much of his tenure and was unable to actually effectuate a smaller American government, right? Spending continued to rise even as taxes continued to decrease. So the fact that there's going to have to be a conversation around what happens next in the Republican Party, I think that's been a long time in coming. I think that Trump is such a unique cultural figure that he was basically able to paper all of that over by saying whatever he wanted at any given time. He still does that, right? He'll still do the populist anti-trade routine, and then suddenly he'll be pro-free trade, and then he'll be in favor of subsidies to particular manufacturers, and then he's anti-subsidies. He'll be in favor of taxes on the rich, and then he's not in favor of taxes on the rich. So there's going to be a really interesting debate, and I think it has broken out a little bit. You've seen it between sort of the nationalist conservative wing of the Republican Party and the more libertarianist wing of the Republican Party. I do talk about it a little bit in the book, the sort of future of conservatism and this notion that seems to be building on the right, that the power of government should actually be exacerbated for use by the right in changing the culture. I think that's seeing this stuff backwards. I think there's no limiting principle to that. And I think that you should always examine the powers you're giving to government with the knowledge that within 4 to 8 years, the other side's going to be controlling those exact same powers. Let's
talk a little bit more about Biden, especially because we've got the Democrats having their convention at the time as your book has come out. Does the pick of Kamala Harris even matter? Is this, at the end of the day, it's just purely a referendum on Trump?
So it feels right now like it's mostly a referendum on Trump. There is an opening with Kamala Harris's pick for Trump to actually change the narrative. He needs to ignore Biden. He needs to basically act as though Biden isn't there. And if I were Trump, I would go into debate, and the first thing Joe Biden says, I would say, listen, Joe, I care about what you think, but let's be honest, I don't really care about what you think because, frankly, 6 in 10 Americans think you're not finishing out your first term. So the person I should be debating here is Kamala Harris. So why don't we, instead of debating what you think, Joe, why don't we debate what the person who you selected as your running mate thinks, since that person presumably will be finishing your first term? And I think that he should say it straight out like that. I think that it would be saying the unsayable, which is typically Trumpian, right? It would be really dropping a bomb in the middle of the debate. And he kind of needs to do that at this point. He needs to shake it up because right now Biden's campaign is, I'm going to be barely conscious in my basement and I'm just going to ride the wave of anti-Trumpness to victory. And that's working for him. And so in order for Trump to win victory, he's going to need to remind Americans that you're not going to get Joe Biden if you elect Biden-Harris. You're going to get Kamala Harris. You're going to get her agenda. It's going to be Bernie Sanders' agenda. It's going to be the same lady who was saying she was going to use executive action to push gun control. The same person who was saying she was going to push Medicare for all before she was saying she wasn't going to push Medicare for all before she said she was. So what exactly are you getting here? it ain't going to be Joe Biden. And frankly, I think that should be the attitude. I think the attitude should be that Joe Biden is a complete non-entity who doesn't matter. I think politically, Trump almost has no choice, because it turns out, as I've said before, that it's very difficult to beat a dead horse. And right now, that is precisely the situation that Trump faces. He has to beat a dead horse, and Biden's the dead horse. So the only way to do that is to redirect focus toward the live horse, the live horse being the VP, who, again, most Americans think is going to finish out Biden's first term.
Well put, Ben. I know you're not a medical doctor, but going back on that point about not finishing the first term, you've watched politics for years. You've seen Biden pre-vice president. Has he lost more than a step? I mean, do you think there's legitimacy to the argument that we're talking about dementia setting in and this could be very dangerous?
I'm not going to diagnose it because I'm not a doctor. I will say he's lost a step. There's no question he's lost a step. And whether that is just the natural, effect of aging, or whether that is, some form of dementia or senility, I can't diagnose what he's got. All I can tell you is what I see and what everybody else sees, which is he is slower. He is not able to string together long chains of thought. He randomly kind of warbles off into a different key. He starts talking about random things at random times. He stops himself from talking because he understands that if he talks too long, he's going to blunder himself into a situation. He's got enough energy for short bursts, but anything longer than about 15 minutes, and he starts to fall apart pretty quickly. And then he gaffes at an extraordinary rate that the media seem to continually ignore. So does he appear not healthy? Yes. Does he appear not to have it all there? Yes. But I've been informed reliably by the reliable source, Brian Stelter, that he is absolutely fine. And the reason we can tell that Joe Biden is absolutely fine is because the other day he rode a bicycle, which is a hell of a test. I mean, my 4-year-old son can ride a bicycle, but I don't think he's qualified to be president either.
Let's go back to your point about this is really Trump versus what Kamala Harris stands for, not Trump versus Biden. Does that mean that if Biden were elected, we're going to see reparations? I mean, it's actually going to happen.
No, I don't think the Democrats would even know how to effectuate that. Reparations is a good pitch. It's a very bad policy. And Democrats run up against a couple of obstacles. One is, how do you even pose the policy? What does the policy look like? Are you talking about giving every descendant of an American slave $100,000? That's a lot of money. Not only is it a lot of money, it doesn't actually solve any of the underlying problems. It turns out that helicopter cash actually doesn't fix underlying systemic problems that exist in communities where there's significant crime, where there's lack of fathers, where the educational system sucks, where there's lack of choice. Right now, all of the underlying issues are not solved by simple grants of money. That is not the case. Also, if you were to say that, then what is the next step? So I think if Americans were asked to sign a check of that size, most Americans say, okay, I guess we're done with this now, right? The mission is over. We're done. And that is such a deep core part of the Democratic Party platform, which is that American systemic racism is there. It's never going away and can never be alleviated. Right? I mean, Barack Obama literally said it's part of the American DNA, that it would actually undercut their own argument to continue making this an issue and exaggerating it as an issue in American life. I think that it would be very difficult to effectuate, because how do you determine who deserves it and who doesn't? So you'd say, okay, American descendants of slavery. What about people who are American descendants of slavery who are technically not Black under most rubrics? People who had one African-American ancestor 3 generations ago. Are those people considered American descendants of? What if the other side of the family were people who were slaveholders, right? That horribly enough, that has happened a lot in American history. What if you have a situation in which you have people paying reparations who are brand new immigrants to the country, have not benefited from slavery in any way? How about Americans who are Black by ethnicity, but are not American descendants of slaves, right? Well, what Kamala Harris would fit into this category. So does she receive reparations? What do you do about the fact that there are an enormous number of Black Americans who are middle and upper class? I know that the stereotype in the American media is that all Black Americans and American descendants of slaves are living in inner cities and suffering from extraordinary poverty. But that simply is not the case. The median family income in the United States for Black Americans is $41,000, and the average family income for household income for Black Americans in the United States is $58,000. So Black Americans are, by statistics, the richest ethnically Black people on planet Earth. So how exactly do you square that? Are you going to make a white, impoverished person from Appalachia whose ancestor fought for the Union Army pay reparations to Jay-Z? How exactly does that work? So these are all fraud issues, which is why you never see Democrats really take on the specifics of reparations. Reparations is a pitch to basically say America is bad and owes you something. And if you get into specifics of how you would actually measure that, then it would be very difficult to either measure that or effectuate it. And the final point is, it seems to me that if you're talking about, as Democrats have, 400 years of discrimination against Black people, no check you can sign really alleviates the harm that has been done. $100,000 is completely insufficient to the damage done. If you're talking about total damage done to generations, to maybe 20 generations of people over the course of 400 years, how do you even ballpark that? There's really no way to do that in any fair or decent way.
Just a few current event questions. The UAE, most recent deal with Israel, I presume you've either already written about it or you certainly will. How historically important is it to Israel and to hopefully eventually peace in the Middle East?
It's extraordinarily important. The reason it's extraordinarily important is because it gives a lie to the central false notion of American foreign policy in the Middle East for at least 3 generations, which is that at the heart of all Middle Eastern conflict lies the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And that is just not true. So this has been a hallmark of every American foreign policy in the region for literally decades, is that if Israel would only give a little more, if only there could be a durable peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis, then peace would flourish. No Arab country will ever cross that line and make peace with the Israelis unless the Palestinians are given some sort of deal, unless the Israelis give up safety and security to what effectually amounts to a terror state. There won't be any movement in the Middle East. Israel and the UAE just completely shattered that model. Now, it's been obviously true for a while, right? The foreign policy establishment suggested that when Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, that the entire Middle East would go up in flames. None of that happened. They suggested that when the United States recognized the obvious truth that Israel would never give up the Golan Heights and it was sovereign Israeli territory, that they said it was going to set the Middle East on fire. Nothing. They said that if Israel didn't make concessions to the Palestinians, there'd be significant pressure from the Arab world on Israel. None of that ever happened. So what really just happened here is that the UAE made clear that the future of the Middle East is basically the conflict between Shia and Sunni. It is not the conflict between Arab and Jew. The future of the Middle East is looking at Iran as the most significant threat in the Middle East, and that allies against that threat who are looking forward to, in many cases, liberalization and free market economies, can ally with one another in opposition to the malocracy in Iran. It's transformative, and you're already starting to see the effects. Sudan is about to sign on. Oman and Bahrain are probably going to sign on. Morocco is probably going to sign on. I think Saudi Arabia is not too far in the future signing on. Jordan already has a treaty with Israel. That doesn't mean all these people are best friends. It does mean that the fundamental recognition that Israel isn't going away has begun to set in for everyone and is now perfectly obvious. And it also means that when the Palestinians hold up any sort of peace deal on the basis that the Arab world is going to be on their side, no matter what exorbitant and crazy demands they make, no matter how terroristic they act, it's not true. So the pressure is on the Palestinians at this point that if at any point they want a state, they're going to have to recognize realities on the ground and also stop being extraordinarily associated with terrorism.
Yeah. Let's skip vote by mail. Is this just another fabrication? That's being generated now in Trump's, of course, trying to suppress the vote and the rest. What's your view on post office, this whole thing?
This whole thing, it's the stupidest scandal I've seen in a very long time. So there are a few things going on. One, the post office has been running a budgetary deficit for 14 straight years. The post office has been basically bankrupt since the internet. Since people started buying things via the internet and mostly corresponding via the internet, the post office has completely been skunked. And it's been skunked not really because of even losing money on the postage. It's because they have exorbitant contracts with public service unions, and they've been paying into those, and that really is the amount of the billions of dollars in deficit. They had $75 billion in deficit going into COVID, and then COVID happened, and everybody stopped sending mail completely. So that was, so the idea that we have to bail out the post office was always very silly. Democrats then conflated that with universal mail-in voting. So universal mail-in voting is a bad idea. The idea that you're going to be sent just a ballot. You're not going to have to apply for an absentee ballot, which is totally legit and a different thing, but that you will, by just de facto, by default, you're going to be sent a ballot in the mail to an address you may no longer occupy to a person who now lives there, and that you can combine that with ballot harvesting by various Democratic and Republican operatives. That people are going to go door to door. They're going to find all the registered Democrats. They're going to go to their door, knock on their door, and say, I want you to vote straight line Democrat. Give me the ballot. Or give me your unfilled ballot, and we'll see what happens with it. Right? That is rife with the potential for at the very least voter confusion and at the very most voter fraud. When it comes to the post office has explicitly said that the state laws that apply do not actually meet with the restrictions the post office is undergoing. Meaning there are a lot of states that say you can apply for an absentee ballot 4 days in advance of an election. It takes like 5 days just for the post office to turn that around, and then another 10 days for the post office to receive the ballot if you vote that day. So what they say is we need at least 15 days prior for you to request an absentee ballot, for you to even have the possibility of getting your vote in time. Democrats immediately say, well, what if somebody votes? And sure, it's after the technical date of the election, but don't you want everybody to have their vote? Okay, well, now you've got unbelievable confusion. We have no way of figuring out who won and who lost. It's a disaster area. So that's issue number 2. So Republicans are right to oppose the bailout of the post office. They are right to oppose universal mail-in voting. It has nothing to do with preventing people from voting. The post office is funded through 2021. Every person who votes by mail in proper fashion will have their vote counted so long as the vote counting mechanisms are correct. All of the nonsense about shifting out of particular types of mail because Trump's trying to stop people from mail-in voting is absolute crap. It's been crap from the beginning. It is a complete conspiracy theory. The pictures you're seeing online of mailboxes being removed, it used to be that there were 400,000 mailboxes in the United States. Now there are 160,000 mailboxes in the United States. People don't use mailboxes as often, and so we have reduced the number of mailboxes on the streets. It is a pure conspiracy theory. Now, Trump, in his natural fashion, decided that it would be a wonderful idea to simply jump both feet on the landmine and say in an interview on Fox that that if we don't fund the post office, then they won't be able to have universal mail-in voting. It's false and it's stupid. But it allowed the Democrats to claim that this is all a conspiracy to stop people from voting by mail. So now what we have is the entire Democratic Party invested in the narrative that if Joe Biden loses, it's because Trump subverted the vote. And that is a horrible, horrible idea. It is a horrible thought. Worst statistic of the day, 45% of Americans trust that the results of the election are going to be verifiable and tenable. 45%. So this is going to go very, very poorly no matter how it goes. Basically, unless it's a massive blowout for one side or the other, there's going to be incredible levels of scrutiny and discontent. And I would not be shocked if there's some sort of violence in the streets.
Yeah, this is very dangerous stuff, right? This is right at the root of it all. It's scary, Ben. I don't know if you're a sports fan, but I wonder how you feel about what's happened with respect to this whole systemic racism in sports and all that. It used to be you could go to a football game, basketball game, baseball game, whatever, and have 6 different colors of people in the same row rooting for the same team or against each other, whatever, but it was a terrific thing in America. Now it seems like we've lost it or we're about to lose it all.
Yeah, I mean, I am a huge sports fan. I subscribed to Sports Illustrated basically from the time I was 13 to the time I was maybe 27. I only stopped subscribing because Sports Illustrated became so overtly political, and then ESPN became MSNBC with footballs, and it's become very clear at this point that sports has been thoroughly politicized. I think it's a great loss to the country, frankly. Now, if you say this, then you're accused of being a snowflake. Listen, everybody is allowed to say what they want. If you wish to run your sports league like a woke social justice session, you're free to do it, and I'm free not to watch. And the idea that I'm supposed to, be cudgeled into buying into your social justice messaging because I wish to watch a basketball game is not something that I'm going to buy into. There's also something extraordinary about watching disproportionately very talented, very young, athletic people of color earning millions of dollars a year to play a sport on TV talking about how America is deeply and systemically racist. That is a pretty incredible statement. And one that, again, is unfalsifiable on any number of levels. We've lost something as a country when all of the areas we go to cool down are no longer cool down spaces. Like they're all gone. We can't watch a movie together because not only can we not go to theaters these days, but also the movies have become so overtly political. We can't watch sports together, which was the ultimate apolitical arena. And when people say, well, the national anthem was political, no, it wasn't. Stop that. The national anthem was never political. The flag was never political. These were certain things that were basically assumed to be at the root of American citizenship. Doesn't mean you can't do things against them. You can. You have every right to. But this was basically, mom, apple pie, and baseball. Well, now we are being told that in order to watch a baseball game, I have to hear Morgan Freeman do a voiceover on empathy, and I have to watch baseball players kneeling for the false notion that America is systemically racist. I'm just not going to do it. I love baseball. I have not watched a single game of baseball this season, nor will I, until they stop with the political messaging inside things that I want to watch. And if that never happens, then I guess I'm not watching again. And I'll wait till there's an alternative sports league form that is apolitical. I'm not calling for a Republican sports league. I'm calling for an apolitical sports league so I can just watch Madame Sports and be left alone for 5 minutes on the couch with a beer. I do not feel like this is too much to ask. But again, corporate America is very much driven by profit and not at all driven by kind of adherence to deeper principles than that profit. In some cases, that's fine. In the case of you are specifically catering to the loudest political market at the expense of a huge number of other Americans who don't like this sort of stuff, I think it's going to bear some pretty significant consequences for these businesses, but you can see exactly why they're doing it. And you can see by differential sports league how they are treating these issues, right? There's a reason that the NHL is not doing this. The NHL's audience is 93% white. There's a reason the NBA is doing this. 45% of the NBA's audience is black. Well, that is a pure and overt attempt to cater to a particular political audience. To ignore the capitalistic element of all of this is to fail to understand that these sports leagues are not, in fact, repositories of great social justice belief systems. They're merely catering to markets.
Last question, Ben. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future? I mean, there's a whole lot that's wrong in this day and age, but at your core, do you think we can climb out of this and the country's going to be fine, or are we really at risk of, some of the worst times in America ahead of us?
I think that the next 10 years are going to be very difficult. I think that they're going to be very difficult until Americans are forced to snap out of it and wake up. In Israel, right, there was a period in Israeli history. It's called sort of the post-Zionist era. It was really in the aftermath of Oslo, where there was this crisis of conscience that went on in Israel, where people in Israel were like, should we even exist as a nation? Is there a reason the state of Israel should exist? Maybe we should be like the post-Zionist state, where Judaism doesn't matter anymore, and we cut peace deals, and a lot of people leave, and really, what's our raison d'etre? Then there was a rise of an enemy in the Palestinian Authority committing great acts of terror, the rise of Hamas, and now the entire Israeli population is center-right. Because they realize that, no, there is a pretty good reason why Israel ought to exist. This is not uncommon. This has happened for many nations in the past. Right now, we are living through the rise of a post-American America, where people are wondering, why exactly should we exist? What is it that we bring to the world? Especially when you have people who are contending that Israel is deeply, especially when you have people contending that America is deeply vicious and evil, and all of our liberties are a false facade. So what could happen here? A couple of things. One, things could get so bad that people wake up. Two, there could be an existential threat on the horizon like a China that simply draws Americans together, as it seemed that we did for about 5 moments after 9/11. Or three, there's a whole swath of Americans who just don't know anything about politics and don't follow it closely. And I used to place my faith in people who were really well informed. And now I feel like those people might be destroying the country. So we actually need to aim at all the people who really are not paying attention and are simply cudgeled into taking particular political positions by sort of the movement of the day. The silent majority really is not a silent conservative majority. It's just people who don't know enough to ask, who are not particularly involved, and who have been misinformed that everybody has the same goals for America in mind. And that isn't the truth. So I think that an educational program of vast scale is necessary in order to save the country. And I hope that the book can be a part of it, but I hope that everything that we're doing can be a part of it.
Yeah, well, that book right on your table, Ben, it's an enormously important contribution to the current debate, and I can't thank you enough for writing and for talking with us today about it. But congratulations, and the very best to you with this book and the incredibly important books I know you'll write in the future.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Take care of yourself, Ben.
We hope this conversation has inspired you to share what you've learned with your family and friends, and that you'll join us again for an upcoming event.
And let me offer lesson number 1 about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do.